He waited 32 minutes for a woman he'd never met and walked away with something he hadn't expected to find again. A single father who stopped believing in second chances. A billionaire who stopped trusting people who smiled too easily. One rain-soaked night. One table by the window. One sentence that neither of them saw coming. This isn't a story about wealth or fate. It's about what happens when two people who've been quietly surviving finally meet someone worth being honest with. If this story stays with you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The reservation was for 7 o'clock. By 7:15, Landon Hayes had already read the menu twice, front to back, including the wine pairings he had no intention of ordering. By 7:20, he'd started arranging the silverware out of habit. Fork straight, knife straight, spoon pushed slightly to the right the way his daughter Emma always did when she was pretending to set a fancy table in their apartment kitchen with mismatched plastic utensils and total seriousness. He almost smiled thinking about it. Almost. By 7:30, the young waiter, a kid who couldn't have been more than 22 and was trying very hard not to look like he felt sorry for Landon, appeared at the table for the second time. "Can I get you anything else while you wait, sir? Some bread, maybe?" Landon looked up. The kid had the expression of someone delivering mild bad news, polite, carefully neutral. "No, thank you," Landon said. "Just water's fine." "Of course, absolutely." The waiter lingered half a second too long before retreating. Landon set his phone face down on the white tablecloth. Then he picked it up again. No messages. He put it back down. The restaurant was called Tidal, one of those upscale waterfront spots on the east side of the city where the lighting was permanently set to golden hour, and every table had an unobstructed view of the harbor. It wasn't the kind of place Landon normally went. He owned exactly 2 dress shirts, one black, one pale blue, and he'd ironed the blue one twice that afternoon because the first time he'd somehow made the wrinkles worse, and Emma had watched him from the doorway of the bathroom with her arms crossed, saying, "Daddy, you look nervous." And he'd said, "I'm not nervous. I'm just ironing." And she'd said, "You never iron," which was completely true. He was 32 years old. He worked in structural engineering for a mid-sized firm that mostly dealt in commercial renovations, the unglamorous end of the field, the kind of work that involved crawl spaces and load-bearing assessments and arguing with contractors over cost overruns. He made decent money. Not great money, but decent. Enough to keep their 2-bedroom apartment on Clement Street, enough to cover Emma's school and his father's part-time care aide, and still put a little away each month, though not as much as he'd hoped. He was not by any visible measure the kind of man who ate at Tidal on a Tuesday night. This whole thing had been Marcus's idea. Marcus Webb was Landon's oldest friend, a man constitutionally incapable of minding his own business, who had been insisting for over a year that Landon needed to, and Marcus's exact words were, re-enter the atmosphere. As if Landon were a spacecraft that had gone quietly dark somewhere past the orbit of normal human experience and needed someone on the ground talking him back in. "She's not a setup," Marcus had insisted over the phone last week, which was exactly what someone said when it was absolutely a setup. Look, she's someone I know through Diane's work thing, and she mentioned she hasn't really been on a date in a while, and I thought, Marcus, what? You're setting me up. I'm facilitating a coincidence. That's not a thing. It's absolutely a thing. Landon had said no. Then he'd thought about it for 3 days, which was longer than he wanted to admit, and then he'd called Marcus back and said fine, one dinner, and Marcus had made a sound like a man who had just won a small but personally significant bet. The details had been sparse. Her name was Vivian. She was around 30. She worked in business. Marcus had been vague in a way that Landon had attributed to Marcus being disorganized, which was also possible since Marcus was in fact deeply disorganized. It hadn't occurred to Landon that the vagueness might be intentional, that Marcus might have reasons for not spelling out exactly who Vivian was. That oversight would present itself in approximately 12 minutes. Right now, the rain had started. It had come on suddenly, the way late spring storms did in this city. A stillness, then a smell like cold concrete, then rain sheeting against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Tidal in waves. The harbor beyond the glass turned dark and choppy. People outside moved fast, ducking under awnings, holding bags over their heads. Inside, the restaurant felt sealed off from it, warm and amber lit and quietly humming with the specific sound of a place where nothing too difficult was supposed to happen. Landon watched the rain for a while. His water glass was still mostly full. He'd been careful about that. He didn't want to be on his fourth refill of water when she walked in. Assuming she walked in. At 7:34, the odds were starting to shift on that. He thought about Emma, who was spending the night at his father's place across town. Pop had picked her up at 4. Landon had packed her a bag with her stuffed rabbit and her favorite cereal and a note reminding her not to let Pop stay up too late watching sports, which she would absolutely not enforce because she found sports broadcasts deeply soothing for reasons no one in the family fully understood. She'd given Landon a very thorough inspection before he left, walking around him once with her hands clasped behind her back like a small building inspector. And then she'd said, "You smell good, Daddy." And he'd said, "Thanks, Bug." And she'd said, "You should go on more dates." And he hadn't known what to say to that, so he'd just hugged her for slightly longer than usual and left. She was 6. She'd been saying things like that for about a year now, mostly because her kindergarten teacher had gotten engaged over the winter and Emma had developed a very specific idea about how the world was supposed to progress. It wasn't sad exactly, it was a thing. Landon reached for his wallet. He'd give it 5 more minutes, he decided. Then he'd eat somewhere else. There was a Korean barbecue place 3 blocks over that he actually liked, and he'd call Marcus on the walk home and have a conversation that Marcus richly deserved. The restaurant doors opened. He heard them before he saw her, the rush of rain-wet air that cut briefly through the climate control, and then the sound of heels on polished hardwood, quick and purposeful. He looked up out of reflex, the way you looked up when a door opened, not expecting anything in particular. She was standing just inside the entrance, rain-dark and slightly breathless, pushing a strand of wet hair back from her face with one hand and scanning the room with a directness that was almost unsettling. Not rude, just precise, like someone who was accustomed to walking into rooms and immediately understanding the geometry of them. She was wearing a dark blazer over a silk blouse, both now carrying the slight sheen of rain. Her heels were sensible, not decorative. She had the look of someone who had dressed carefully for this and then gotten ambushed by weather and decided, somewhere between the car and the door, to just accept it and move forward. Their eyes met across the restaurant. She didn't wave. She didn't smile the immediate, reflexive smile that people performed when they spotted someone they were supposed to be meeting. She just held his gaze for a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, and then she walked toward his table, weaving through the other diners with efficient grace, shaking water from her sleeve as she went. Landon stood. He didn't know exactly why he stood. Habit, probably. His father had been very clear about that kind of thing when Landon was growing up. You stand when someone comes to the table, Landon. It's just how you do it. And so he stood, and he was suddenly very aware of the ironed shirt and the straight silverware, and the fact that he'd been sitting alone for 34 minutes with his phone face down like a man doing penance. She stopped in front of him. He could see now that her eyes were a dark shade of brown, and she was wet in a way that clearly bothered her less than it should have, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Then she said, "You have kind eyes." Not, "I'm so sorry for being late." Not, "You must be Landon." Not, "This weather is insane, right?" Just that. She said it quietly, almost like she was noting something to herself and it had simply come out. And then she seemed to realize that she'd led with it, and something shifted in her expression. Not embarrassment exactly, more like the recognition that the sentence had gotten ahead of her. Landon stood there for a moment. "Thank you," he said finally. "I think." The corner of her mouth moved. "That came out strange." "A little." "I meant it, though." "Okay," he said. She set her bag down and held out her hand. "Vivian, I'm sorry I'm late. It's been a complicated evening." He shook her hand. Her grip was firm, not performative about it. "Landon, and it's fine." "It's not, actually," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "Being late is rude. I hate being late." She said this matter-of-factly, not in a self-flagellating way, just as a statement of personal record. 34 minutes. I know how long it was. I didn't count, Landon said. She looked at him. 32, he admitted. That got a real smile, quick, unguarded, over almost before it started, but real. She picked up her menu, and Landon sat back down, and the young waiter appeared with the speed of someone who had been waiting for this exact development, and the evening began. They ordered. Vivian asked the waiter 2 direct questions about the fish, where it was from, how long it had been on the menu, and listened to his answers seriously before deciding. Landon ordered the steak, which felt unimaginative, but was the only thing on the menu that had looked like food to him and not like an artistic concept. For the first few minutes, they were careful with each other in the way that people were careful when they'd been dropped into proximity with a stranger and were trying to figure out whether it was going to be terrible. How do you know Marcus? Landon asked. I don't, really. He knows someone I work with. Diane? She looked at him. Diane's his wife. Right. Marcus called me 2 weeks ago, very confident voice, told me he had the perfect person for me to meet, said I had to trust him, gave me almost no useful information. She tilted her head slightly. Very disorganized man. He really is, Landon said. He told me you were in construction. Engineering, structural. Is there a difference? I get that a lot, Landon said. The short version is I figure out whether things will hold up before they get built, and then I argue with the people building them about whether I'm right. Do you win the arguments? About 70% of the time. What happens the other 30? Usually nothing catastrophic, he said. Usually. She almost smiled again. What do you like about it? The question caught him slightly sideways. Not because it was unusual, but because it was direct, the kind of question people asked when they actually wanted to know, rather than when they were filling space. He thought about it for a real second. There's a thing that happens when you're on site, he said, when a structure that's been on paper for months is actually standing. You can see where the math held and where it didn't quite, where the real world made compromises with the plan. I don't know. It's satisfying in a specific way. The gap between the model and the thing, she said. Exactly. She nodded, looking at her water glass. I know that gap. What do you do? He asked. Marcus was, as noted, not very informative. Something moved in her expression. Not avoidance, more like the slight recalibration of someone who was accustomed to her answer to that question changing the room and was deciding how she felt about that tonight. I run a company, she said. Sterling Group. Technology adjacent, mostly. Infrastructure software, some fintech, a development arm we're trying to grow. She said it the way a person said something they'd said 10,000 times, efficiently and without performance. I started it when I was 23. Landon processed that. He knew the name. Sterling Group was not the kind of name you didn't know if you lived in this city and paid any attention at all to business news, which Landon did in the abstract way that people did when they had a subscription to a newspaper app they opened on their commute. Sterling Group had recently closed a deal that had been on the front page of the business section for 3 consecutive days. He looked at her across the table. She was waiting. Marcus didn't mention that, Landon said. I know, she said. I think he was worried you'd cancel. Landon considered that. Would that have been so bad? No, she said. But he seemed to think so. She looked down at her menu again, though they'd already ordered. I'm aware it's a strange thing to lead with, or not lead with. I never know which is worse. What usually happens? He asked. Usually the conversation shifts. People get more careful or more performative about being casual, which is its own kind of strange. Sometimes they start pitching ideas at me. Once a man asked me within 4 minutes if I knew anyone at... She stopped. It doesn't matter. It just changes things. Does it bother you? She looked up. That's an honest question. Sorry, No, she said. Don't be sorry. Yes, it bothers me. She said it plainly. I worked very hard to build something real. I'm proud of it. But somewhere along the way, the number got bigger than the person, and most people are really only interested in talking to the number. The food arrived. The waiter set down Landon's steak and then reached for the plate he was carrying for Vivian. And then his heel caught slightly on the edge of the table's base. Nothing dramatic, just a small stumble. And the plate tilted, and the carefully arranged fillet of halibut slid 4 inches to the left, and one of the accompanying sauces spilled partially onto the rim of the plate and partially onto the white tablecloth. The waiter went pale. "I'm so sorry," he said, and his voice had the particular pitch of someone who had been having a hard shift, and this was the thing that might tip it over entirely. "I'm so sorry. I can have this remade. I'll get the manager—" "Please don't," Vivian said. He stopped. She was looking at the plate with calm consideration. "The fish is fine. The sauce on the cloth isn't ideal, but it's not your fault. This table's base has an odd angle. I noticed it when I sat down. Can I just get a small cloth?" The waiter blinked. Yes, of course. "And if you have a moment, a little more water would be wonderful." She smiled at him. Not the polished, public-facing smile that Landon would eventually learn to distinguish from the real ones, but something quieter and more genuine. "Thank you." The waiter retreated, looking like a man who had just been unexpectedly pardoned. Landon watched all of this. Vivian noticed him watching. "What?" "Nothing," he said. She looked at her slightly displaced plate. "The fish is actually still fine." "I know," he said. "That's not what I was thinking." She didn't ask what he was thinking. She picked up her fork, and they continued. It took them another 20 minutes to get comfortable, not because there was anything wrong with either of them, but because two people who were genuinely paying attention to each other required a little time to calibrate. They weren't performing a date, they were having a conversation, and those were different things. Vivian asked about his work, not the elevator pitch version, the actual version. She wanted to know what a structural engineering assessment actually looked like, day to day. And Landon found himself describing a project he'd been on the previous spring, an old hotel conversion downtown where the original 1940s construction had used a rebar specification that hadn't technically been wrong but had been wildly inconsistent, and the process of documenting it had taken 3 weeks and involved a lot of photographs and heated discussions with a project manager named Carl who had opinions. "What happened to Carl?" she asked. "He's fine. He disagreed with 3 of my load calculations. We went back and forth for about a week, and then we were both right about different things, which is actually the best-case scenario." "Do you like Carl?" Landon thought about it. "I respect him. He cares about the building. A lot of project managers care about the budget and the schedule. Carl actually cares whether the thing will stand up, which makes him difficult to work with, but I'd rather work with difficult people who care than easy people who don't." Vivian set her fork down and looked at him for a moment. "What?" he said. "Nothing. I said almost that exact thing to my board of directors 6 months ago and got a very polite lecture about team dynamics." "What happened?" "I hired the difficult person anyway." "And?" "He's the best operational director I've ever had," she said. "He makes everyone furious about twice a month and then solves the problem that everyone else missed. Carl would like him," Landon said. She laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, and the sound of it was different from the careful almost smiles from earlier. Something in the room shifted a degree or two. They talked about Emma. Landon had been cautious about this. You never knew, early on, how people were going to receive the fact of a child, and he'd learned the hard way that some people received it the way they received a complication, a thing to be managed around. He mentioned Emma factually, the way he mentioned any part of his life, and watched Vivian's face while he did. She didn't manage around it. She asked questions. "How old?" "6. She turned 6 in March." "What's she like?" "She's—" Landon paused because describing Emma accurately required a level of precision he took seriously. "She's very serious about things she cares about and completely unmoved by things she doesn't. She has very specific opinions about the proper way to make a grilled cheese sandwich. There's a butter-to-bread ratio she's worked out. And she wants to be a marine biologist because she saw a documentary about octopuses and decided they were the most interesting animals. And every week she asks me one question about the ocean that I can't answer, so I have to look it up and report back to her the next morning." Vivian had both elbows on the table now, which was the position of someone genuinely interested and who had stopped caring about table manners. "What was this week's question?" she asked. "Why do some fish have transparent bodies?" "What's the answer?" "Mostly camouflage. They're small, often live in open water without places to hide, and transparency makes them effectively invisible to predators. Some of it is also thought to be related to light sensitivity." He paused. "I spent 45 minutes on this last Wednesday night." "She sounds like a scientist," Vivian said. "She absolutely is. She's going to be insufferable when she's older." He said it in the tone of someone describing their greatest pride. Vivian was quiet for a moment. "You raise her alone?" "Yeah, since she was 3. He didn't elaborate on that, and she didn't push, which he registered without remarking on it. "And your father?" she asked. "You mentioned—" "He's 71. He had a minor stroke about 2 years ago. Nothing too serious in the grand scheme, but it affected his mobility some, and he can't drive anymore. He lives across town. He's stubborn as hell and completely convinced he doesn't need help, which means I visit 3 times a week, and we argue about whether he should eat more sodium until one of us gets tired." "Does he?" "Eat too much sodium?" "Categorically, yes." Landon picked up his glass. He grew up on a farm in Georgia. He believes salt is a natural resource, and anyone who limits it is a coward. Vivian smiled at the tablecloth. Then something in her face changed, a small shift, almost imperceptible, the kind of change that came from a thought that arrived uninvited and settled in. "Are you okay?" Landon asked. She looked up. "My mother is sick," she said. She said it the way a person said something that they had been not saying for a while, and the effort of not saying it had worn down the framing until it just came out direct. "I'm sorry," Landon said. "It's cancer. She started treatment 3 months ago, the aggressive kind." She said this matter-of-factly, but her hands had moved together on the table, fingers loosely interlaced, and that told a different story. She's fighting it. She's the most stubborn woman I've ever known, which is probably in her favor." A brief pause. "My brother called when I was in the car tonight. He panics easily. He'd heard something she said and misinterpreted it and convinced himself it was worse than it was. And we spent 40 minutes talking him off that ledge, which is why I was late." "Is it?" Landon asked. "Worse than it was?" "No," she said. "Today was just a hard day." She has them. She looked at the harbor through the rain-streaked window. She tries to protect us from the hard days, and we try to protect her. And mostly, we're all just protecting each other from the truth, which is that we're scared, and we don't know what's coming. Landon didn't say anything immediately. He let the sentence exist without rushing in to cover it. "I know something about that," he said finally. She looked at him. "The protecting each other thing," he said. "Emma doesn't know how much I think about her future. My dad doesn't know how closely I monitor his. We're all just walking around carrying these versions of worry that we've dressed up to look like ordinary life." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. "That's an unusually honest thing to say to someone you just met," she said. "You started it," Landon said. She looked at him, and something in her eyes was different now. Not softer exactly, but clearer, the way a room looked different when someone opened the window. "I did," she said. The restaurant was nearly empty when they noticed. It happened gradually. The tables around them cleared one by one, and the ambient noise of a full dining room dropped away, and the staff had started moving with the particular quiet efficiency of people who were too professional to say, "We'd like to close now," but were communicating it through the careful removal of things. The candles on empty tables had been extinguished. The lighting had been brought up slightly. The young waiter was folding napkins at the service station with focused energy. "I think we should go," Vivian said. "I think so too," Landon said. Neither of them moved immediately. The bill came. There was a brief, slightly awkward negotiation. Vivian reached for it. Landon said he had it. She said that was unnecessary. He said it wasn't a statement about anything. It was just that he'd gotten here first, and that counted for something. She gave him a look that was half amused and half assessing, and in the end they split it, which was probably the correct outcome. Outside, the rain had stopped. The harbor air was cold and clean. The wet pavement reflected the dock lights in long orange streaks, and the city sounds came back at a reduced volume. Distant traffic, a boat horn somewhere out on the water. Vivian's car was parked on the street nearby, a black sedan that was understated in the way that very expensive things sometimes were. They stood on the sidewalk. "Thank you for waiting," she said. "It was fine," he said. 32 minutes isn't fine," she said. "I know what that feels like. You sit there and you think, and you know what you think. So," she looked at him. "Thank you for still being there." Landon looked at her. The cold air had brought some color into her face, and she was still wearing the slightly rain-damp blazer, and she still didn't seem particularly bothered by it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes?" "What you said when you walked in, about your eyes." She didn't look away. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "I walked in and you'd been waiting a long time, and I expected—" She stopped. "Most people would have looked at me the way people look at someone who has wasted their time. And I had wasted your time. I deserved some version of that." She tilted her head slightly. "But you didn't. You just looked at me like a person, like someone you were trying to figure out." Landon thought about that. "I was going to leave," he said. 5 more minutes, and I was gone." "I know," she said. "But you didn't leave angry. You were just going to go home." She looked out at the harbor for a moment. "There's a difference." He didn't have a response to that, not immediately. "I spend a lot of time around people who perform," she said. "Perform gratitude, perform interest, perform respect. It's so constant that I've almost stopped noticing." She turned back to him. "But some things you still notice." "Like whether someone's actually angry versus just inconvenienced," Landon said. "Like that," she said. The boat horn sounded again, farther away this time. "I'd like to see you again," Vivian said. She said it the same way she'd said everything else, directly, without performance, just putting the thing out there and accepting whatever happened to it. Landon looked at her for a moment. The collar of her blazer was still slightly askew from the rain. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that." She nodded once. Professional, almost. Then she smiled, that quick, real smile, and turned toward her car. "Landon," she said without turning back. "Yeah." "Say, the octopus question, what do they do with their transparency? The fish?" "They go invisible," he said. "Completely. Sometimes the only visible part is the eyes." She considered that for a moment, her back still to him. "That sounds about right," she said. Then she got in her car and drove away, and Landon stood on the wet sidewalk outside Tidal with his hands in his pockets and the harbor dark behind him, and thought that Marcus Webb was going to be absolutely impossible to deal with after this. He called Emma on the walk to the train. It was late, later than he'd told her. But Pop answered on the second ring, which meant they were still up, which meant Emma had almost certainly won the stay-up battle by deploying the documentary tactic, where she started asking questions about whatever was on television until Pop fell asleep mid-answer and she was technically unsupervised. "Dad," his father's voice said, slightly graveled with tiredness. "You eat?" "Yeah, Pop, I ate." "She wants to say goodnight." A shuffling sound, and then Emma's voice, immediate and clear. "Daddy, did you have fun?" He walked under a streetlight, hands in his pockets, the rain-wet city quiet around him. "Yeah, Bug," he said. "I had fun." "Is she nice?" He thought about 32 minutes and a plate of fish, and a woman saying you have kind eyes, like she was noting something in the margin of her own private record. "Yeah," he said. "She's nice." "Good," Emma said, in the deeply satisfied tone of a 6-year-old whose worldview had just been confirmed. Pop fell asleep. "Can I watch more octopus?" 10 minutes, he said. "Then you sleep." 20. 10. 15. 12, he said. "Final offer." A pause. "Deal," she said. "Good night, Daddy." "Good night, Bug." He hung up and kept walking. The city was quiet. The harbor was somewhere behind him, dark and cold and full of things swimming in the dark that no one could see. He thought about visible eyes. He walked home. Marcus called at 8:15 the next morning. Landon was in the middle of making Emma's lunch, the specific grilled cheese that met her standards, which required the butter to be room temperature. not cold, because cold butter tore the bread, a distinction Emma had communicated to him with the gravity of someone delivering a safety briefing. He had his phone propped against the backsplash and was pressing the spatula down on the sandwich when Marcus's name appeared on the screen. He let it ring twice on principle, then answered. "Well," Marcus said before Landon had gotten a single word out. "Good morning to you too." "Don't do that. Don't give me good morning. You were out until almost 11 on a Tuesday, which I know because Diane texted Vivian and Vivian texted back from the cab, which means there was a cab, which means—" "Marcus, tell me." Landon flipped the sandwich. The bread had gone a perfect even brown on one side, which Emma would inspect and either approve or find a problem with. "It was good." Silence on the other end. Then, carefully, "How good?" "We talked for 3 hours." The sound Marcus made was not dignified. "I'm going to need you to be a normal person about this," Landon said. "I am being completely normal. Did you get her number?" "We exchanged numbers when she left." "Has she texted?" Landon looked at his phone. There had been a message at 7:42 that morning. Just 3 words. The octopus answer. He'd stared at it for a full minute before responding with, "I thought you'd appreciate it." She'd replied with a single period, which he'd spent longer than he wanted to admit interpreting, and had finally decided meant acknowledged rather than anything more or less than that. "We've been in contact," he said. "I need you to understand," Marcus said, "that I have been waiting 14 months for this phone call. 14. I have been patient. I have been strategic. I have been—" "You gave me almost no information about who she was," Landon said. A brief pause. "Did that bother you?" Landon thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "Actually, no. It was better." The sandwich was done. He transferred it to the cutting board and cut it diagonally. Emma was deeply committed to diagonal, and called toward the hallway. "Emma! Breakfast!" "I'm telling you," Marcus said, with the satisfaction of a man who had been vindicated. "I know what I'm doing." "You absolutely do not know what you're doing," Landon said. "You got lucky." Same outcome. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her pajamas with a book held open in both hands, reading while she walked, which was a habit Landon had given up trying to break because she never ran into anything, and it made her happy. "Is that Marcus?" she asked, without looking up from the book. "Yes." "Tell him I said his haircut looks bad." "She says hi," Landon said into the phone. "She is my favorite person in your family," Marcus said. Landon put the phone on the counter while Marcus continued talking and watched his daughter set the book down with careful precision at the edge of the table. Spine up, open to her page, which she did not dog-ear because she had strong opinions about dog-earing, and climb into her chair and examine the sandwich with the focused attention of a quality inspector. She picked it up, considered it from 2 angles, and took a bite. "Good diagonal," she said. It was, Landon thought, a decent morning. The decent mornings had been harder to come by for a while. Not because things were bad exactly, more because the texture of ordinary life had gotten very flat, very consistent, in the way that things got flat when you were running on maintenance mode rather than actually living. He got up, he made lunch, he dropped Emma at school, he spent 8 hours figuring out whether buildings would fall down, he picked Emma up, he cooked something or ordered something, he put her to bed, he looked at his phone, he did it again. There was nothing wrong with any of it. He just hadn't noticed it much. He noticed it this morning. He wasn't sure what to do with that. Vivian called 4 days later on a Saturday afternoon. Not a text, an actual call, which was unusual enough in this decade that Landon picked up partly out of surprise and partly because he'd been on his roof deck replacing a section of weathered wood and had his phone in his pocket and answered it on reflex. "Are you somewhere loud?" she asked. "I'm fixing a board on my deck. Hold on." He set down the drill and moved to the railing, looking out over the back of the building. The cluttered urban geometry of other rooftops, water towers, one rooftop garden 3 buildings over that someone had been tending all spring. "Okay." "I'm sorry to call out of nowhere," she said, and she said it in a way that suggested she'd thought about whether to call and had made a deliberate decision. "I'm sitting in a parking garage waiting for my brother to come back from a pharmacy run, and I needed to talk to someone who wasn't going to try to fix anything." Landon leaned against the railing. Is something wrong? My mom had a bad night, Vivian said. She's okay, she's stable, but she had a reaction to one of the medications, and my brother drove her in at 2 in the morning, and I got there at 3, and she's okay, but it was... She stopped. It was a bad night. Yeah, Landon said. I know we've only met once, she said. That's fine, he said. Tell me. So she did. She talked for 20 minutes, sitting in a hospital parking garage, describing a night that had involved a lot of waiting and fluorescent lights, and the specific hell of watching someone you love look small in a hospital bed, and how her brother, his name was Daniel, 26, prone to spiraling, had held it together better than she'd expected, and how her mother had at one point told them both to stop hovering because she was trying to sleep, which was, Vivian said, actually a good sign because her mother only got bossy when she felt well enough to. That does sound like a good sign, Landon said. I know that. My head knows that. She exhaled. But you sit there in the waiting room at 3 in the morning under those lights, and your head isn't really running the show. Landon thought about the night 2 years ago when he'd gotten the call about his father's stroke. He'd been in the middle of an ordinary Thursday evening, Emma asleep, him at the kitchen table with a sight report, and his father's neighbor had called, an older woman named Mrs. Park, who'd found Pop on his kitchen floor. He'd called his cousin to come stay with Emma, and he'd driven across town and walked into an ER waiting room and sat for 4 hours under the same kind of lights, alone, thinking about all the things he should have said and done and all the calls he'd been too busy to make. He hadn't told anyone about those 4 hours. Not Marcus, not his colleagues, nobody. He'd just held them and gone back to work on Monday, and that was that. What is it about waiting rooms, he said. Vivian made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. They make everything feel permanent. Yeah, he said. That's exactly it. They were quiet for a moment. It wasn't the uncomfortable kind of quiet. It was the kind that settled in when two people were in the same place emotionally and didn't need to fill it. How do you do it? Vivian said. With Emma and your dad both, and how do you hold all of that? Not always gracefully, he said. Sometimes I get it wrong. I forget things. I'm tired for no reason that I can explain to a 6-year-old. I lose my patience over stuff that doesn't matter. My dad and I have the same argument about his diet every single week, and it never resolves. And I know it's not really about sodium. It's just the only way we know to tell each other we're paying attention. He paused. You just keep going, not because you figured it out, but because stopping isn't an option. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Daniel, she said. He could hear her brother's name change in volume, meaning he'd walked back up. Then to Landon, I have to go, thank you. You don't have to thank me for a phone call. I do, actually. A brief pause. I'll call you when things are calmer. Or when they're not, he said. A beat. Or when they're not, she said. She hung up, and Landon stood on his roof deck in the afternoon light and looked out over the city and thought about the space between the plan and the actual thing, and how rarely they matched up, and how you dealt with that. He picked up the drill. The board needed fixing regardless. On. They went on a second date 12 days after the first. Not a dinner. A bookstore, which had been Vivian's idea, offered via text on a Wednesday night with no particular preamble. There's a used bookstore on Ashford Street, open Saturday afternoons. I haven't been in 3 months, and I'm overdue. Landon had read it twice and then written back. I'll meet you there at 2. The store was called Between the Lines, and it had the geography of a place that had been growing organically for several decades without anyone imposing order on it. Rooms that connected to other rooms, shelves that ran at odd angles, stairways that went up half a flight to small landings where someone had placed a chair and a lamp. It smelled like old paper and whatever the owner brewed in the back, something with cardamom. Vivian was already there when Landon arrived, standing in the section marked History/Biography, with a book open in her hands, reading the back cover with focused attention. She looked different here than she had at Tidal. At the restaurant, she'd been slightly braced, the person who walked into rooms knowing she'd be looked at, carrying the professional armor even when she was trying not to. Here she was just a woman in a worn jacket looking at a book about someone she was trying to decide if she cared about. She looked up when she heard him. There's a whole shelf of military history back there, she said by way of greeting, that I have to physically avoid or I'll spend 2 hours and too much money. Noted, Landon said. Do you read much? When I can, Emma runs the household reading schedule, which means we do a lot of ocean science and anything with animals. Sounds reasonable, Vivian said. Before the company got to a certain size, I used to read almost every night. Now it's usually around midnight, 10 pages, and then my face hits the book. She put the biography back on the shelf. I'm trying to get back to it. What do you read? Biographies, history, some fiction, not as much. She moved down the aisle and he followed, the way you did in a bookstore, falling naturally into the same drift. I like reading about people who built things under difficult circumstances. Not because it's inspirational, more because I find the specific problems interesting, what they got wrong, what they didn't anticipate. The gap between the model and the thing, Landon said. She looked at him sideways. Exactly. They spent an hour in the store. It wasn't structured or guided. They split up, came back together, split up again. Landon found a book on bridge engineering from the 1970s that had a detailed chapter on failure case studies, which he knew was not a glamorous find, but which was genuinely exciting to him in the way that professionally specific things were. Vivian emerged from the fiction section with 3 paperbacks that she carried with a slight guilty expression. I said I was going to buy one, she said. Who were you telling that to? Myself, last week, when I talked myself into coming here. How'd that go? She looked at the 3 books. I have no self-control in bookstores. That seems fine, Landon said. They paid for their books and left and found a coffee place 2 doors down that was narrow and slightly too warm and had exactly 4 small tables, all occupied. They stood at the counter with their coffees shoulder to shoulder in the limited space and talked. She told him more about Daniel, the younger sibling dynamic, how she'd spent most of her 20s in a kind of unspoken caretaking role for him, not because he was incapable, but because he'd struggled in the specific way that sensitive people struggled in families where the older sibling was the one who seemed to have everything sorted. He's smart, she said. He's actually one of the smarter people I know. But he compares himself constantly, and I don't know how to turn that off for him. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Every time he panics, part of me thinks it's because I was too capable, too young, and it made him feel like there was nothing left for him to be good at. That's not how it works, Landon said. I know that, but knowing it doesn't help. No, she said. It really doesn't. He told her about Emma's mother. Not in detail, not the full version, but enough. Her name was Rachel. They'd been together 3 years, married for 1.5 of those, and she'd left when Emma was just past 2. Not cruelly, not dramatically, just gone in the slow way that some departures happened, where you looked up one day and realized the distance had become a decision. She lived in Portland now, had a different life. She and Landon had settled into a kind of civil, distant co-parenting arrangement that worked mostly on paper and required careful management in practice. Emma sees her a few times a year, he said. School holidays, summer, it's okay. Emma knows she has a mom. She doesn't know all the context, and she doesn't need to yet. Does she ask about it? Sometimes. She asks why they don't live together, and I tell her that some families are different shapes, and she thinks about that for a while and then goes back to whatever she was doing. He looked at his coffee. She's better at accepting things than I am. Kids usually are, Vivian said. Yeah, he paused. It was hard for a while. I don't mean it was hard in a way I couldn't handle. I mean, I spent a lot of energy trying to be twice as present to make up for the absence. And at some point you realize you can't do math like that. You just have to be there for real and stop counting. Vivian watched him. When did you figure that out? About 8 months ago, honestly. He set his cup down. There was a Saturday where I was so exhausted from trying to give Emma a perfect day that I fell asleep on the couch at 6:30, and she put a blanket over me. And when I woke up, she'd gotten herself a snack and was sitting next to me with her book. And she was completely fine. He stopped. I'd spent so much energy on perfect that I'd missed how fine things already were. Vivian was quiet for a moment. I do that, she said, the compensating. With my mother, with Daniel, with the company. She stared at her coffee. If I just work hard enough, manage it carefully enough, I can get to the version where nothing goes wrong. She said it without self-pity, just recognizing it for what it was. It doesn't work. No, Landon said. It really doesn't. She looked up at him, and there was something in her face that he was starting to recognize. That slight lowering of the thing she usually carried between herself and other people. The professional composure that was so ingrained it had become indistinguishable from her personality, except in moments like this. The coffee place had gotten crowded. Someone needed the counter space, and they moved toward the door by mutual unspoken agreement, stepping out into the street. The afternoon was overcast, the kind of gray that didn't quite make it dark but flattened all the light, so everything looked like it had been photographed on slightly old film. "Can I tell you something?" Vivian said. "Yeah. I have not had a conversation like either of these in a very long time." She said it directly, looking at the sidewalk rather than at him. "I mean a real one, where I'm not managing what I say because of who I'm talking to." A pause. "I forgot it was possible." Landon thought about the flat texture of his recent mornings. The maintenance mode feeling he'd noticed had lifted. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." She looked up at him. Something about the overcast sky made everything a little softer. She was holding her bag of books against her side, and her collar was slightly up against the gray air, and she didn't look like a billionaire standing on a sidewalk. She just looked like a person. "I should go," she said. "I told Daniel I'd come by this afternoon." "Okay." She didn't move immediately. "Next Saturday?" "What's next Saturday?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I'll think of something." "I trust your judgment," he said. She gave him the quick, real smile. "That may be premature." "Probably," he agreed. She started walking and then stopped and turned back with the slight unscripted quality that things had when they were genuine. "The board you were fixing," she said, "on your deck. Did you get it?" He'd been surprised she remembered that. "Yeah, it took 3 tries because I measured wrong the first time. The gap between the model and the thing. Every time," he said. She laughed, the real one, the surprised one, and walked away down Ashford Street with her bag of 3 books that she'd meant to keep to one, and Landon stood on the sidewalk and thought that he was very much in trouble in a way that he found, inexplicably, sort of okay. Immersion. The third date was a Sunday afternoon in Hendricks Park, and Emma was there. Landon had not planned it that way. He'd arranged to meet Vivian at the park at 1, figuring his father would take Emma, but Pop had called Sunday morning with a bad hip day. The hip was a whole ongoing situation, separate from the stroke, an old injury that flared irregularly and made him irascible. And Landon had run out of alternatives. He'd almost called Vivian to reschedule. He was holding the phone, trying to figure out how to phrase it, when Emma appeared in the doorway in her coat and her yellow rain boots, which she wore in all weather because she had decided they were her boots, now regardless of conditions. "Are we going to the park?" she said. "We might need to reschedule, Bug." "Because of your friend?" He looked at her. "How do you know about my friend?" "You said friend on the phone to Marcus." She blinked. "Is your friend a she-friend?" Landon was going to have a separate conversation with Marcus about discretion. "It's a woman I've been getting to know, yes." Emma considered this. "Can she come to the park?" "It's not that simple." "Why not?" He genuinely could not answer that in a way she would accept, and also, if he was honest, in a way that made complete sense to him either. "Okay," he said. "Put your hat on too." He texted Vivian, "Change of plan. Is it okay if my daughter joins?" He added, after a second's pause, "She's 6 and she has opinions about rain boots and she will probably interrogate you about fish. You can absolutely say no." Vivian's reply came back in under a minute. "Tell her I know 3 facts about bioluminescent plankton." Emma approved of this response when Landon showed her. "She knows about glowing fish," Emma said. "Apparently." "Okay," Emma said, with the gravity of someone issuing clearance. They met at the east entrance. Vivian was there before them, sitting on a bench with her hands in her jacket pockets, watching a pair of dogs race around the open grass with the full-body commitment that dogs brought to things, and she looked up when she heard them coming. Landon watched Emma assess the situation. Emma had a particular way of evaluating new people. She didn't perform social ease. She took her time, held slightly back, observed. She would tell him later, privately, what she thought, and her assessments were usually more accurate than most adults would have been. "Hi," Emma said to Vivian. "Hi," Vivian said. She didn't overperform it. She didn't use the high-pitched register that adults sometimes used with children, the register that children could hear as patronizing from 3 blocks away. She just said hi, the normal way. Emma tilted her head. "Do you really know about glowing fish?" "Bioluminescent plankton," Vivian said. "Yes. Do you want the short version or the technical one?" Emma's eyes went slightly wider. Most adults offered her the short version automatically. "Technical," she said. Vivian told her about dinoflagellates, single-celled marine organisms that produce their own light through a chemical reaction, how it was triggered by physical disturbance, how it was used both as a defense mechanism and possibly as a way to attract predators to eat whatever was disturbing them. Emma listened with her arms crossed and her weight forward, the posture she had when she was taking something seriously. "So they glow to get help," Emma said when Vivian finished. "That's one theory," Vivian said. "Some scientists think that's part of it." Emma thought about this with great seriousness. "That's smart," she said. She looked at her father. "She knows things." "I noticed," Landon said. Emma nodded once, as if confirming a decision, and then said, "Can we walk now?" and headed off down the path with the self-contained purpose she brought to most things. Vivian looked at Landon. There was something in her expression that he couldn't quite read, something that wasn't amusement exactly, more like recognition. "She's exactly like you described," Vivian said. "What does that mean?" "She processes before she commits," Vivian said. "She doesn't give you a performance, she decides." She watched Emma navigating the path ahead of them, stepping deliberately around puddles, studying things on the ground. "She's going to be something, your kid." "She already is," Landon said. They walked for almost 2 hours. Emma led most of it, directing their attention to things she found interesting. A cluster of mushrooms at the base of an oak that she documented seriously in the small notebook she'd started keeping for observations. A bird with unusual tail markings that she needed identified. A question about whether the water in puddles was the same water as in the harbor. Just moved. "The water cycle," Vivian said. "Yes. Eventually that water has been ocean water and rainwater and groundwater and everything in between. The same water has been everywhere." Emma stopped walking. She stared at the puddle for a long moment. "The puddle used to be the ocean," she said. "Part of it," Vivian said. "A very, very long time ago." Emma crouched down and looked at the puddle with new intensity. "Okay," she said, to the puddle. Then she stood up and kept walking, and Vivian looked at Landon with an expression that was open in a way she didn't always allow herself to be. "She's great," Vivian said quietly. "I know," Landon said. It wasn't a brag. It was just a fact he happened to hold, the way you held the facts about things that were important without needing to put decoration on them. They walked to the end of the park loop and came back around. The light had gone flat and gray again, the afternoon doing what afternoons in this city did, surrendering to the overcast without fanfare. At the exit, Emma tugged Landon's sleeve and pointed at a food cart near the entrance. "Hot chocolate?" she asked. "That's a question for Vivian, too," Landon said. Emma turned to Vivian with the pragmatic directness she applied to all important matters. "Do you want hot chocolate?" Vivian looked at the cart, then at Emma. "I want hot chocolate," she said. They got 3 cups, and Emma held hers in both hands and drank it with the concentrated pleasure she gave to things she'd decided to enjoy. Vivian held hers and stood near the bench and looked out at the park going quiet in the gray afternoon, and Landon stood between them, and the 3 of them were just there, in the ordinary way that people were there together when they'd stopped performing for each other. He didn't mark the moment consciously. He just lived in it. Later, when Emma was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Landon sat on the couch with his work laptop open and a site report he wasn't reading, and he thought about Vivian crouching down to Emma's level without making a production of it, and Emma's face when she learned the puddle had been ocean, and the way Vivian had said she's great, quietly, plainly, like stating a measurement she'd taken herself and confirmed. He thought about how long it had been since any of this had felt possible. He closed the laptop. He sat in the quiet for a while, and the quiet, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel empty. It felt like something that was getting ready to be filled. The thing about getting close to someone was that it happened in layers, and you didn't always know which layer you were on until something pushed through. 6 weeks after Tidal, Landon and Vivian had settled into a rhythm that neither of them had named out loud and both of them were aware of. Texts most days, not the constant, performative kind, but the kind that happened when something occurred to you and the person you wanted to tell about it was her. Calls 2 or 3 times a week, usually late, after Emma was in bed and Vivian had gotten free from whatever the day had demanded of her. Weekends when their schedules allowed, which was not always, and which required a level of coordination that neither of them made a drama about. It was not simple. It was also not as complicated as Landon had expected, which was its own kind of revelation. Emma had opinions, which she delivered periodically and without prompting. After the park, she told Landon that Vivian was smart and knew real things, which in Emma's private taxonomy was the highest possible endorsement. She'd also said that Vivian's jacket was a good color, which was an aesthetic judgment Emma made about very few things and almost never shared. Landon's father had said nothing about any of it, which meant he was listening very carefully and waiting for the right moment. That moment arrived on a Wednesday evening in early June when Landon stopped by after work to drop off some groceries Pop had asked for. It was a warm evening, and Pop was on the small back porch of his ground floor apartment in a folding chair with the sports page and a glass of iced tea that was absolutely full of sugar, which Landon decided not to address. "Emma told me you're seeing someone," Pop said, not looking up from the paper. Landon set the grocery bags inside and came back out. "Emma told you?" "She called me Tuesday night from your phone." Pop turned a page. "Said she wanted to report in." "She's 6. "She's thorough." Pop finally looked up. He was a large man going wiry with age, the Georgia farm still in his posture even now, and his eyes were the same dark, steady brown that Landon had inherited and that Emma had gotten a version of. "This the woman Marcus set you up with?" "Yes." "What's she like?" Landon sat on the porch step. He thought about how to answer that honestly, without performing either caution or enthusiasm. "She's direct. Smart. She's dealing with some hard stuff with her family right now, and she handles it without making it everyone else's problem, which I respect." He paused. "She's not what I expected." "What'd you expect?" "I don't know. Someone easier, maybe." Pop snorted. "Easy's boring. Your mother wasn't easy." He said this with the flat certainty of a man who'd loved one person his whole life and had no regrets about the difficulty. Landon's mother had died 11 years ago, and Pop had kept her photograph on the kitchen counter ever since, not as a shrine, just because that was where it lived, and that was where she was. "It's early," Landon said. I'm being careful." "About what?" "Emma. Mostly Emma." Pop nodded. He looked out at the small patch of yard behind the porch, where a bird feeder he'd installed 2 springs ago had attracted generations of sparrows he'd named with great confidence. "You gonna keep being careful until she's in college?" "Pop." "I'm asking." Landon was quiet for a moment. "I just don't want to get it wrong," he said. Pop looked at him. "Son, getting it wrong is part of it. You think I didn't get it wrong with your mother about 100 times? He picked up his iced tea. "You only get things right by being willing to get them wrong first." Landon didn't respond to that. He sat on the porch step and looked at the yard and listened to the sparrows work through the feeder with methodical dedication, and Pop read his paper, and neither of them said anything else about it for the rest of the evening, which was also how they communicated. The sentence that mattered got said once and then left alone. The complication arrived on a Thursday. Landon found out about it the way he found out about most things he hadn't seen coming, indirectly, at an inconvenient time, while he was already managing something else. He was in a site meeting with a general contractor named Bryce, a man who had the conversational style of someone who'd decided long ago that his time was the most valuable in the room, when his phone buzzed with a news alert. He ignored it during the meeting because Bryce required full attention or he'd interpret any distraction as concession, and Landon had already conceded 2 things that morning that he was unhappy about. After the meeting, in the elevator going down, he looked at his phone. The headline was from the city business desk. Sterling Group faces pressure over fintech subsidiary. Sources point to internal conflict on board. Landon read the article in the lobby, standing against the wall while people moved past him. It was vague in the way that business journalism was vague when the sources were talking but didn't want attribution, implications, and careful phrasing, not specifics. The substance seemed to be that a significant minority faction on Sterling Group's board was pushing for a change in strategic direction for the company's financial technology division, and that Vivian's position on the matter was being characterized as resistant in ways that were creating friction. It wasn't a crisis story. It was the kind of story that lived in the gray zone, enough to create noise, not enough to be definitive. He put his phone away. He didn't text her about it. It wasn't his place to come at her with a news article about her own company, and she'd tell him when she was ready to tell him. He went back to his office and worked through the afternoon and told himself he wasn't checking his phone. He was definitely checking his phone. She called at 7:15. Emma was in the bath, supervised but independent, a bath monitor system that involved periodic knock and response from the hallway, and Landon stepped into the kitchen. "I assume you saw," she said. "Yeah." "How much?" "The business desk piece, the board thing." "That's the public version," she said. Her voice had the particular tight quality of someone who had been managing a situation for hours and was now at the end of where management could take them. "The actual version is more specific and more irritating." "Tell me if you want. You don't have to." A brief pause. "There's a board member. He's been on since the fintech division was a separate entity before the acquisition. His name is Preston Mercer. He's 64 years old, and he's been waiting for me to make a large enough mistake to justify the restructuring he's wanted since day one." She said the name like something she'd been careful not to say carelessly. The fintech division had a rough quarter. Nothing catastrophic, not even unusual given the market conditions. But Mercer's been using it as a pressure point. He has 2 other votes he's been working on for months. What does he want? He wants the division spun off and new leadership appointed before year-end. He wants to take it out of my operational authority. She said this evenly, but there was something underneath it. Not fear, Landon thought. More like the very particular anger of someone watching something they built being discussed by people who didn't build it. He doesn't care about the division. He cares about establishing that the board can override me when there's sufficient political cover. Can they? Technically, with enough votes, yes. Practically, it would create chaos, and he knows it. This is about leverage, not the actual division. She stopped for a moment. "I'm sorry, you don't need all this." "I asked," Landon said. "You were being polite." "I was being interested," he said. "There's a difference." A brief silence. "I have a board meeting in 10 days, she said. "I've been preparing for it for 3 weeks, but the article today changed the framing, and now I have to re-prepare, which means this weekend I'm not going to be able to—" "That's fine," Landon said. "I was going to say I'm sorry." "Don't," he said. "Your company comes first right now. I understand that." She was quiet for a moment. "You're not bothered?" "I'm disappointed about the weekend," he said honestly. "I'm not bothered that you have a real job with real pressures." Another silence, slightly different in quality. "Daddy?" Emma called from down the hall. "I'm done." "2 minutes, Bug," he called back. Then to Vivian, "I have a bath exit to supervise." "Go," she said. "You're going to be okay with this," he said. "The board thing. You built that company. You know it better than anyone in that room." "I know," she said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it," she said. "That's why it helps." He hung up and went to help Emma out of the bath and into her pajamas, and through the nightly toothbrushing argument. Emma had strong opinions about the amount of toothpaste required, which conflicted with the amount Landon put on the brush, and they had a calibration disagreement every single night without resolution. And he thought about what it meant to have a person in your life who was dealing with things you couldn't solve. He was used to fixing things. It was literally his job. He looked at structures and found the places where they might fail and proposed solutions. The idea of sitting with something that he couldn't calculate his way around, that was harder. But he thought about what he'd said to Vivian on that first phone call, in the parking garage. You just keep going. Not because you've figured it out, but because stopping isn't an option. He supposed that applied to more than just the weight-bearing stuff. The board meeting was on a Tuesday. Landon didn't hear from Vivian that morning, which he'd expected. She'd be locked in preparation. He got Emma to school, went to work, spent 3 hours on a site assessment for a warehouse conversion in the south end of the city, came back to the office, and tried to concentrate on a load analysis he'd been putting off for 2 days. At 4:30, a text arrived. It went well. Mercer backed down from the spin-off proposal. The 2 votes he thought he had didn't hold. Landon read it twice. He wrote back, "What happened?" "I came prepared." A pause, then, "I also found out last week that Mercer had been communicating with a competitor about the division. I didn't use it as a threat. I just made sure the other board members were aware of it before the meeting." Landon looked at that for a moment. "You let the information do its own work." "Exactly." Then, "I'm exhausted. I'm getting food delivered and not talking to anyone for the rest of the night. But I wanted to tell you. I'm glad you did. Thank you for last week, for listening to me be angry about it without trying to solve it." He looked at that sentence for a long time. It was such a specific thing to thank someone for. Not for advice, not for action, just for the particular patience of letting someone be in their thing without trying to redirect it. "Anytime," he wrote, and meant it. 2 weeks later, Vivian's mother had a better stretch. The new treatment protocol seemed to be working. Not dramatically, not in a way that meant anything was resolved, but the bad nights had become less frequent, and her energy had improved enough that she'd gone back to her regular Tuesday calls with a friend she'd known for 30 years, which Vivian said was a better indicator than any of the clinical measures. Landon met her for coffee on a Saturday morning, the regular place they'd established on Ashford Street without formally establishing it. They just kept going there, and it had become the place. She looked different than she had during the board meeting weeks. Lighter, not in a resolved way, but in the way of someone who'd been carrying something at maximum weight and had gotten a temporary reduction. "She asked about you," Vivian said. Landon looked up from his cup. "Your mother?" "I mentioned I was seeing someone. She extracted more than I intended to share." A slight expression that was somewhere between embarrassment and amusement. "She asked if you were patient," which was the first question, which tells you something about what she values. "What did you say?" Vivian wrapped both hands around her cup. "I said yes." She looked at him steadily. "I said you were one of the more patient people I'd met." "I'm not always patient," he said. "No one's always patient," she said. That's not what she was asking. She was asking whether patience was something you had access to or not. A pause. "She wants to meet you." Landon was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant thing," he said. "I know," Vivian said. "You don't have to. I'm not asking you to do anything you're not ready for." "I didn't say I wasn't ready," he said. "I said it was significant." She looked at him. "Okay," he said. "When she's up for it." Something moved in Vivian's face that she didn't cover quickly enough. Relief mixed with something more complicated. The expression of a person who'd been prepared for reluctance and hadn't quite calibrated for the absence of it. "I'll tell her," she said. "What should I know about her?" Landon asked. "She'll have opinions about everything within the first 10 minutes and share them without being asked. She doesn't like vague answers. If you don't know something, say you don't know. She finds that more interesting than an approximation. She takes about 20 minutes to warm up to new people, and during those 20 minutes, she'll be polite but slightly formal, and then she'll either relax or she won't, and you'll know which it is." She paused. "She has your same thing." "What thing?" "She watches how people treat people who can't do anything for them. Waiters, cashiers, aides." Vivian looked at the table. "She's been watching that her whole life. Longer than I have." "She raised you on it," Landon said. Vivian looked up. "Yeah," she said. "She did." They sat with that for a moment, the morning coffee going warm around them, and Landon thought about a woman he hadn't met yet who had taught her daughter to watch the room, and what that meant about the kind of person the daughter had become. They took Emma to the aquarium on the last Saturday of June. It had been Emma's idea, or more precisely, Emma's sustained campaign, she'd been asking about the aquarium since early spring, deploying information about it periodically in conversation the way someone plays strategically useful facts. The aquarium has a giant Pacific octopus, Daddy. Did you know that? I read it. And then a week later, the aquarium just got new jellyfish. I heard that. And then, with the timing of someone who had been patient long enough, Vivian would probably like the aquarium. Landon had told Vivian about the campaign, and she'd laughed and said absolutely yes without hesitation. And so on a Saturday morning with reasonable weather, they'd met at the waterfront entrance with Emma carrying her observation notebook and a focused expression. The aquarium was crowded with families. The particular weekend crowd density that turned every corridor into a slow river of strollers and children with their faces pressed against glass. Emma moved through it with the authority of someone who had done research and had a specific itinerary. She navigated directly to the octopus tank with the confidence of someone following a map she had memorized, and she stood in front of the giant Pacific octopus for 4 full minutes without saying anything, just watching. Vivian stood next to her, also watching. Landon stood slightly behind them and did not say anything. The octopus moved with the fluid alien intelligence that made them legitimately strange to observe. It shifted color along one arm, testing something, then went still. Emma's notebook was open in her hands, but she wasn't writing in it. She was just watching. It's thinking, Emma said finally. They're very intelligent, Vivian said. They can solve problems. Open jars, recognize faces. Does it know we're here? Almost certainly. Their vision is very good. Emma turned and looked at Vivian. Does it know you know things about it? Vivian looked at the octopus. That's an interesting question, she said, which was a real answer rather than a deflection, and Emma accepted it as such. They moved through the rest of the aquarium with Emma directing the route. The jellyfish gallery, which she found beautiful but scientifically less interesting. The deep sea exhibit where the bioluminescent display made her point triumphantly at Vivian and say, "That's the plankton thing." The touch pool where she touched a sea star with the precise focus of a researcher performing an approved experiment. Landon watched Vivian move through the aquarium with Emma. He'd watched them together before, in the park, in their growing ease on the phone, in the way Emma now asked if Vivian was coming as a natural part of plans rather than a separate consideration. But there was something about today that was different in a way he was still working out. Vivian never performed with Emma. That was the thing. A lot of adults performed with children. Performed interest, performed enthusiasm, performed a version of themselves that was calibrated to seem kid-appropriate. Vivian didn't do that. She talked to Emma the same way she talked to Landon, directly, seriously, with the actual engagement of someone who was paying attention. And Emma, who could detect performance at a distance the way animals detected weather, had recognized that from the park, and it had only deepened since. Watching them stand together at the jellyfish display, Vivian's hand resting lightly on Emma's shoulder, Emma not even noticing because she'd stopped tracking it, because it had become ordinary. Landon felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was still held tight. Not relief exactly, more like permission. He'd been careful for so long. Careful with Emma, careful with his own expectations, careful about what he let himself want. And standing in a crowded aquarium on a Saturday with the jellyfish moving blue and slow behind the glass, and his daughter leaning very slightly into a woman he was falling for, he thought that maybe the careful was doing less useful work than it used to. "Are you okay?" Vivian asked. He drifted. She was looking at him from next to Emma, who had moved on to the next tank and was already 3 feet ahead. "Yeah," he said. "I'm good." She studied him for a second, the way she studied things she was deciding about. "You have the same face you had at Tidal," she said, "when you thought I wasn't going to show up." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. Emma called from the next tank, something about a fish with an unusual pattern that required immediate documentation. And they moved toward her, and the moment folded itself into the rest of the afternoon the way real moments did, without ceremony. Indeed. The fight happened on a Thursday in July. Not a real fight, not the kind with raised voices and thrown things. The kind that was worse in some ways. A conversation that revealed something one person was carrying and hadn't said, and the other person's response to it landing wrong. They'd been on the phone. It was late, nearly 11, and Landon had mentioned something offhand about a charity gala that Sterling Group was hosting the following month. He'd seen the invitation in an email that Vivian had forwarded him about an event she was speaking at. He'd said something about whether it was the kind of thing he should come to, meaning it genuinely as a question about logistics, about whether his presence made sense in her professional context. Vivian had gone quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. "You don't have to come to things like that," she said. "I know. I'm asking if you want me to." "It's complicated," she said. "Okay," he said. "Explain what's complicated." Another pause, and he could feel her organizing something, choosing words, deciding how much. "The people at these events," she said carefully, "they're going to look at you and they're going to make assumptions." "What kind of assumptions?" "That you're—" She stopped. "That the dynamic is a certain way. That I'm with you because, or that you're with me because—" She didn't finish either sentence. Landon was quiet for a moment. "Are you worried about what they think about me?" "I'm worried about how it'll make you feel," she said. "I've watched it happen to people I know. Someone brings a partner to one of these things, and the partner spends the whole night being asked what they do, and then getting the specific kind of response that tells them exactly how the room values it." "Vivian, I'm serious. I've watched people." "Vivian," he said more firmly, "I'm a structural engineer. I'm 32. I have a daughter and an aging father, and I drive a 6-year-old car, and I iron my shirts myself. I know what that looks like next to your world. I've known that since Marcus told me your name, and I looked up the company." A silence. "And?" she said. "And I don't care," he said. "Not in the way you're worried about. I care about you. I care about whether you want me in that room, not about what the room thinks." He paused. "But you not wanting me there because you're worried about how I'll be received. That's a different thing." "That's not what I said." "It's close to what you said." The silence stretched out. He heard her breathing, slow, deliberate, the way someone breathed when they were deciding something. "I don't want you to feel small," she said finally. Her voice had changed. The careful framing had come down. "I've watched it happen, and I hate it, and I can't. I don't want that to be something you experience because of me." That's not your call to make," Landon said. "I mean that respectfully. You don't get to decide in advance that I can't handle a room full of people with money." A long pause. "No," she said. "You're right. I don't." "Do you want me there?" he asked, direct and simple. A silence, and then, "Yes." "Then I'll be there," he said. Another silence. This one different. Not tense, more like the aftermath of something that had been said and couldn't be unsaid, which was not a bad feeling, just a real one. "I do that," she said quietly. "Make decisions for people about what they can handle." "Yeah," he said. "I noticed. I do it with Daniel too, with the company." She exhaled. "I think if I manage it carefully enough, I can keep people from getting hurt." "And I can't," she said, "obviously, but I keep trying." "I know the feeling," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about the way I said it." "I know you meant it as protection," he said. "That doesn't make it right." "No," he said. "It doesn't, but it makes it human." The conversation wound down from there, slower and more honest. The kind of conversation you could only have after you'd pushed into the uncomfortable part and come out the other side still talking. By the time they hung up, it was past midnight, and Landon sat in the dark living room of his apartment and thought about the specific difficulty of letting people into your life when your whole learned experience was of managing things alone. He thought about Vivian at the aquarium with her hand on Emma's shoulder. He thought about Emma not noticing. He thought about the things you stopped tracking when they became ordinary and what it took to get there. The city was quiet outside. The harbor was somewhere in the dark, and somewhere out there in water the aquarium docent had told Emma could be 38 degrees at depth. Things were moving through the dark with the complete assurance of creatures who had never needed to be seen to know they were there. He went to bed. The gala was in 4 weeks. He ironed the black shirt. The black shirt was fine. Landon had ironed it the night before the gala, and then again the morning of, and then Emma had looked at him getting dressed and said, with the calm authority of someone who had formed a clear aesthetic opinion, that the black shirt was good but the collar needed to sit flatter. And she'd stood on her step stool and adjusted it with both hands, the way she'd seen Landon adjust her hair clips, focused and serious. And when she was done, she'd stepped back and assessed and said, "Now you look right." He'd looked in the bathroom mirror and thought that she was not wrong. He drove to the event venue, a converted waterfront space that Sterling Group used for larger functions, the kind of building that had been a shipping warehouse in a previous life, and now had exposed beam ceilings and very expensive lighting. And he sat in the parking structure for 2 minutes before getting out. Not because he was nervous exactly, more because he wanted to arrive at a decision about the evening before the evening started. He knew what Vivian had been worried about. She'd been worried because she was right that rooms like this had a way of communicating hierarchy through very small signals. The way conversations paused and restarted, the way eyes moved, the way someone asked a question and listened to the answer or didn't. She'd been in those rooms for years, and she knew their grammar. What she'd underestimated was that Landon had been in versions of those rooms too, just from the other side. Job sites where the project investor came to walk through and talk to the developer and not to the engineer. Client meetings where the person with the budget spoke to the senior partner and not to Landon, even when Landon was the one with the answer. He knew what it felt like to be technically present, but socially invisible. And he'd made his peace with it a long time ago. He got out of the car. Vivian was near the entrance when he arrived, talking to two people in the specific way that people talked when they were being professional rather than present, attentive, composed, not entirely there. She spotted him over the taller person's shoulder, and something shifted in her face. Not dramatically, just a small adjustment, like a key finding its lock. She wrapped up the conversation in under a minute and came over. "Collar's good," she said, looking at him. "Emma fixed it." Of course she did. She was wearing a deep green dress that was understated and exactly right. She'd told him once that she found elaborate event dressing exhausting and preferred things that didn't require attention. She looked, he thought, like herself, which was a harder thing to manage than most people realized. "How are you?" "Good," he said. "You?" "Functioning," she said, which was her word for evenings that required professional performance rather than actual presence. "There are about 120 people here, and I know most of them, and genuinely like maybe 15. You'll meet the 15, the rest will navigate." "I've navigated construction sites with active disagreements," he said. "I'll manage a gala." She almost smiled. "Follow my lead when I need to be in work mode. When I'm done with someone, I'll usually touch your arm. That's the signal." "The signal," he repeated. "Don't make fun of the signal." "I'm not," he said. "I think the signal is efficient." She gave him the quick, real smile and turned toward the entrance. The evening proceeded in the way that events like this proceeded. In circuits, with brief stops, with a lot of introductions that Landon absorbed and Vivian navigated with the expertise of someone who had been doing it for years. He shook hands, said his name, answered the "what do you do" question with the same honest brevity every time, and watched how people responded to structural engineer the way a naturalist might observe the behavior of a consistent stimulus applied to different subjects. Most people nodded and moved on, which was fine. A few asked follow-up questions that were genuine. One woman, a city planner named Reyes, who was on Sterling Group's Urban Development Advisory Committee, got genuinely interested in a conversation about seismic retrofitting requirements, and they talked for 20 minutes in a corner while Vivian was pulled into a presentation handoff. And by the end, he'd gotten her card and she'd asked if he'd ever consulted for municipal projects. Two people did the thing Vivian had warned him about, the specific recalibration, the way the conversation found other places to be once the answer to "what do you do" had registered. Landon noted it without drama and moved on, because it was exactly what he'd expected, and it said nothing about him that he needed to spend energy on. The thing that surprised him was Preston Mercer. Landon hadn't expected to meet him. Vivian hadn't mentioned he'd be there, or if she had, Landon hadn't registered it as something to track. He recognized the name when a colleague of Vivian's introduced them. Mercer was older than he'd imagined, trim and silver-haired, with the manner of someone who'd been important in a room long enough that he'd stopped having to announce it. Mercer shook Landon's hand with the slight extra pressure that men of that generation used to establish something. "You're with Vivian," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Landon said. Mercer looked at him with the direct assessment of a man taking a measurement. "How long?" "Few months." "And what is it you do?" "Structural engineering," Landon said. "Commercial mostly, renovations and seismic work." Mercer nodded. Not dismissive, not engaged, just processing. "She doesn't usually bring anyone to these," he said. "I know," Landon said. A pause. "She's a very capable woman," Mercer said. It landed as a sentence that was meant to contain more than its surface. "Yes," Landon said. "She is." "She's also very stubborn," Mercer said, sometimes to her detriment. Landon looked at him steadily. "Most people who've built something significant are," he said. "I'd be more worried if she wasn't." Mercer's expression didn't change, but something in it recalibrated. A slight, almost imperceptible adjustment. He nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, and then turned as someone called his name from across the room. Vivian appeared at Landon's side 30 seconds later. She must have seen the exchange from across the room. "What did he say?" she said, her voice quiet, watching Mercer's retreating back. "That you're capable and stubborn." "What did you say?" "That stubborn was appropriate given what you built." She was quiet for a moment. "How'd he take that?" "Fine," Landon said. "He's testing things. He's been testing things for a long time. It's just what he does." She looked at him. "You're not bothered by him." "No, why would I be?" "He's been trying to undermine me for 2 years." "I know," Landon said. "That's between you and him and the board. He's not relevant to me." He picked up his glass. "Unless you want him to be." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she touched his arm, not the signal, something different, deliberate and unhurried, and said, "Thank you for being here." "I told you I would be," he said. The evening ended past 10. They stood outside while valets moved cars through the circular drive, and Vivian had her heels off by then. She'd put them in her bag at some point during the final hour and was standing on the stone in her bare feet, which he suspected was a thing she did the moment she could get away with it. "That was exactly what I thought it would be," she said, except for the Reyes conversation, which was interesting. "She wants to consult on a municipal project." "I know. She told me." Vivian looked at him sideways. "She said you were the most interesting engineer she'd talked to in 3 years, which from Reyes is a specific and real compliment." "I'll follow up with her," he said. "You should." A pause. "You were good tonight. You didn't try to be something you weren't." "I'm not good at that anyway," he said. "Most people are," she said. "In those rooms, most people perform. They angle, they optimize. You just talk to people like people." She looked at the drive. "I forgot it was possible to do that in those rooms." Landon thought about that. "You do it," he said. She shook her head slightly. "I'm managing in those rooms, always. There's a difference." "Yeah," he said. "There is." Her car came. They stood by the door for a moment in the way they'd stood outside Tidal the first night. The city sounds all around them, the warmth of the summer night different from the cold spring rain, but the geometry of it the same. Two people at the edge of an evening, not quite ready to have it be over. "My mother," Vivian said. "She's having a good week. I talked to her today and she sounded like herself." She said it carefully, the way you said things about a sick person that you were afraid to say too confidently in case they stopped being true. "She keeps asking when she's going to meet you." "When she's ready," Landon said. "No pressure." "She'll tell me when she's ready," Vivian said. She is not shy about that kind of thing. "Good," he said. "I want to meet her." She looked at him. "Even knowing what that means? What it might—" "The situation isn't resolved, Landon. She's better this week, but the situation isn't resolved, and meeting her means becoming part of that." "I know what it means," he said. "You have enough of that already," she said. "Your dad, Emma, Vivian." He said it the way he'd said it on the phone during the board argument. Not sharp, just steady. "Stop protecting me from things I'm choosing." The night air moved between them. "Okay." she said. Okay, he said. She got in her car and he watched the taillights disappear down the drive and thought about structures, about the ones he spent his days assessing, the ones he spent his life building, the ones that looked different from the inside than they did on any plan. He met Eleanor Sterling on a Sunday in early August. Vivian had picked him up in her car, which she almost never did. She was fastidious about keeping her professional and personal logistics separate, a habit from years of paparazzi interest that she'd never entirely stopped maintaining. He'd read it as a signal, a deliberate one, and he didn't comment on it. Eleanor Sterling lived in a mid-rise apartment on the north side of the city, a place she'd moved to 5 years ago after her husband died, Vivian's father, whom Vivian spoke about the way you spoke about a room you'd grown up in, as something so foundational you'd stopped seeing the walls. The apartment was a good size, lived in the specific way of someone who had opinions about furniture and had been accumulating them for decades. Books on every flat surface. Photographs not arranged in a gallery sense, but placed where they'd been put down and left because that was where they belonged. Eleanor was in an armchair when they came in, a blanket across her lap that she'd clearly been persuaded to keep there by someone other than herself. She was smaller than Landon had pictured. He'd built an image from Vivian's descriptions, and he'd overestimated the physical scale, though he'd gotten the eyes right. She had Vivian's eyes. Same dark color, same steadiness, same quality of landing on something and staying with it. She looked at him the way Vivian looked at things she was trying to figure out. "Landon," she said. Not a greeting exactly. More like confirming a label. "Mrs. Sterling," he said. "It's nice to meet you." "Eleanor," she said. "Mrs. Sterling was my mother-in-law and she was a trial." She looked at Vivian. "Get him something. He's been standing in the doorway." They sat. Eleanor asked Vivian 2 questions about the company that had nothing to do with the company. She was asking about Vivian's tiredness level, Landon understood, using professional questions as proxies because Vivian responded better to those. It was a practiced translation, the language of a mother and daughter who had developed a private code over years. Then Eleanor turned to Landon with the directness that Vivian had inherited and in some ways refined. "What do you do?" she asked. "Structural engineering," he said. "I work on commercial buildings mostly, figuring out whether what's standing will stay standing and what to do when the answer is complicated." Eleanor considered this. "My husband was a civil engineer," she said. "Roads." He said engineering was the practice of knowing what you didn't know yet. "That's a good description," Landon said. He was a precise man. She looked at her hands for a moment. Vivian got that from him. The precision. She looked up. "You have a daughter." "Emma, she's 6. What's she like?" He gave Eleanor the honest version, the grilled cheese standards, the observation notebook, the octopus documentary, the weekly ocean question he had to research and report on. Eleanor listened with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested, not just being polite, and at the part about the weekly question she said, "She sounds like she'll be a scientist," and Landon said, "That's exactly what Vivian said." And Eleanor's expression did something interesting and brief. "Did she?" Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Eleanor looked at her daughter across the room. Vivian was looking at her phone with the performative attention of someone who was actually listening to a conversation they were pretending not to monitor. Eleanor looked back at Landon. "She hasn't brought someone here before," Eleanor said. "In all the years. I've met people, but she brought them to neutral places, restaurants, events." She said it matter-of-factly. "Not here." Landon didn't respond to that. He let it sit. "How do you find her?" Eleanor asked. It was such a direct question that he took a moment to respect it by answering it directly. "Honest," he said. "She says what she means when she decides to say it. She's careful with people she cares about, maybe too careful sometimes, but it comes from somewhere real." He paused. "She doesn't take shortcuts on things that matter to her. I find that worth a lot." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "She works too much," she said. "I know. She always has. Even before the company was what it is. She has her father's capacity for work and none of his ability to stop." She looked at the window. He used to say she was the most driven person he'd ever known, and he'd said that to her face, and she'd taken it as the compliment he meant it to be. But I always thought there was something running underneath it. Like she didn't quite believe that being was enough, that she had to be doing, always. Landon thought about Vivian on the parking garage call, exhausted, just needing someone to not solve anything. He thought about her hands in the coffee shop, wrapped around the cup, saying, I think if I manage it carefully enough, I can keep people from getting hurt. Yeah, he said. I see that in her. Eleanor looked at him. And? And I don't think it's a problem to solve, he said. I think it's something you sit with and you let her know it's okay to put it down sometimes. He paused. You can't make someone believe they're enough. You can just be there when they're starting to. The room was quiet. Eleanor looked at him for a long, steady moment. The full version of the look, unhurried and direct, the same architecture Vivian used when she was deciding something. Then she said, You want more tea? Which Landon understood from everything Vivian had ever told him about her mother was exactly what yes looked like. Vivian had heard it too. Across the room, she'd set her phone down. They stayed 2 hours. At some point, Daniel arrived. He'd texted Vivian that he was coming by, which meant he'd orchestrated it to overlap with Landon's visit because he was 26 and not subtle about his curiosity. He was thinner than his photographs, with the slightly kinetic energy of someone who thought faster than he spoke and sometimes tripped on the gap. He shook Landon's hand with both of his, which was a habit rather than a statement, and asked 3 questions in the first 5 minutes that covered Landon's job, how long he'd known Vivian, and whether he'd ever been to Georgia, the last of which had no discernible logic, but which Landon answered anyway. Pop grew up in Georgia, Landon said. Daniel looked immediately and genuinely interested. Where? Outside Savannah. I drove through Savannah once, Daniel said. It's a different world. The trees. He sat down on the arm of the couch, the informal posture of someone still figuring out where they fit in a room. Vivian said you have a daughter. Emma, 6. She sounds great. Vivian told me about the octopus thing. She talks about Emma? Landon asked. All the time, Daniel said, and then looked at Vivian as if he might have said something he shouldn't have, and Vivian gave him the expression of an older sibling who was filing this away, and Daniel made a face and redirected the conversation. Watching them together, Daniel and Vivian, Landon saw the thing Vivian had described but hadn't fully conveyed. The way she tracked him without seeming to track him. The small recalibration she made when he was in the room. The careful balancing act of a person who loved someone and had learned to hide how much she was managing on their behalf, because they could feel it, and it made things worse. Daniel felt it anyway, Landon thought. Not all of it, but the shape of it. He'd been living in his sister's shadow long enough to recognize when he was standing in it. At the door leaving, Eleanor held Landon's hand for a moment longer than a standard goodbye. You'll come back, she said. Not a question. Yes, he said. If you'll have me. I just said I will, she said, with the mild impatience of someone who didn't enjoy repeating herself. Vivian, in the background, was managing an expression with partial success. In the car, driving back, Vivian was quiet for a long time. She liked you, she said finally. I liked her, he said. She doesn't extend the tea offer to people she's neutral about. Vivian watched the road. The last person she offered tea to was Daniel's friend from college, who she ended up calling every Christmas for 3 years. Good tea precedent, Landon said. Very good tea precedent. She drove. She asked me before you arrived. She asked if you were the kind of man who stayed. Landon looked at the road ahead. What did you say? Vivian was quiet for a moment. I said I thought so. I said I was still finding out, but I thought so. And now? He said. She glanced at him. Now I think so more. He looked out the window at the city moving past. The neighborhood shifting from the residential north toward the mix of commercial and residential in the middle, toward his side of town, the harbor-adjacent streets that still had the functional, unglamorous quality of a city that worked rather than a city that performed. He thought about Eleanor saying she had to be doing, always, and Vivian saying, I don't quite believe that being is enough. He thought about his father on the back porch saying, "You only get things right by being willing to get them wrong first." "I'm not going anywhere," he said, the same words he'd said at the aquarium. They meant more now. "I know," she said. And this time there was no pause before it, no fractional hesitation, just the words, clean and settled. September came in warm and stayed that way. Emma started first grade and came home every day with the energy of someone who had been absorbing information at high velocity and needed to offload it. The names of new classmates, a teacher who had a fish tank in the classroom with fish, Emma needed to identify. An incident at lunch involving a disagreement about whether a tomato was a fruit that had escalated into an almost philosophical debate and ended with a draw. Landon sat with her most evenings while she did this, one ear on her, one eye on whatever needed doing. The comfortable ambient quality of a household that had found its rhythm. Vivian had dinner with them on a Wednesday in mid-September. It had happened before, but not regularly. The logistics of her schedule and his didn't always cooperate. And there was a version of the dinner logistics that involved Emma's specific pre-dinner routine and the window where she was still functional and not tired. And Vivian understood this, had adapted to it without being told, had started texting on Wednesday afternoons to confirm timing rather than assuming. That evening, Emma showed her the observation notebook, the full one now, not just the aquarium entry, all the months of notes and small drawings and questions with answers and questions still open. She didn't show it to many people. She'd shown it to Pop and to Marcus once and to her teacher. She handed it to Vivian and sat next to her at the kitchen table and walked her through it with the focused pride of someone sharing something private and important. Vivian turned the pages carefully. She asked questions, real ones, the kind that required Emma to think rather than just report. She pointed to a drawing Emma had made of the transparent fish from part 1 of the research and said, "You drew the eyes bigger. Why?" Emma looked at the drawing. "Because the eyes are the part you can see," she said, "even when everything else is invisible." Vivian looked at the drawing for a moment. "That's good science," she said, "and good art." Emma accepted this with a nod and turned the page. Later, after Emma was in bed, Landon washed dishes and Vivian sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug of coffee that had gone slightly cold, and the apartment had the quiet that it had after Emma was asleep, which was a specific kind of quiet, not empty, just held. "She showed you the notebook," Landon said. "I know," Vivian said. "I noticed." He set down the dish. "She's never shown anyone that notebook without being asked. I didn't ask her to show you." Vivian was looking at the table. He could see her processing something, the way she processed things that landed somewhere deeper than the surface. "Landon," she said. "Yeah." She looked up. Her eyes were steady, but there was something behind them that he hadn't quite seen before. Not new exactly, just closer to the surface than usual. "I'm scared," she said. He waited. "Of this," she said. "Of how real this is. I've kept things at a managed distance for a long time. Deliberately. Work is clean, work is something I can control. This..." She stopped. "Emma showed me her notebook. Your father calls you 3 times a week about sodium. You come to board galas in an ironed shirt and talk to Preston Mercer like he's a colleague and not a problem." She shook her head slightly. "I didn't expect it to feel like this." "Like what?" he said. "Like somewhere I live," she said, "rather than somewhere I'm visiting." He came around the counter and sat across from her at the table. The overhead light was the soft one. Emma had lobbied successfully for a warmer bulb 6 months ago, and it made the kitchen feel smaller and more specific, the way spaces felt when the lighting was right. "I know," he said. "It scares me," she said. "I want to be honest about that." "I know that too," he said. "You want to know the truth?" "Yes." "I'm scared too," he said. "I've been scared since the bookstore, since the park, since Emma came home and told my father about you because she wanted to file a report." He looked at her steadily. "I'm scared and I'm still here, which I think is the only honest answer to the fear." Vivian looked at him. "You're not going to tell me it'll be fine," she said. "I don't know if it'll be fine," he said. "Your mother is sick. And my dad's hip is getting worse. And Emma's growing up in a way that's going to require a lot of me I haven't figured out yet. And your company is in a period that demands things from you. And none of that resolves cleanly. He paused. But I'm not interested in fine. I'm interested in real. She was quiet for a long moment. Real is harder, she said. Real is harder, he agreed. She looked at her coffee. Then she looked at him. Okay, she said. It was a small word. It was a large thing. The kitchen held them both in its warm light, ordinary and specific. A half-dried dish on the counter, a 6-year-old's observation notebook on the table, the ambient sounds of a city that went on regardless. And two people who had both learned the hard way that you couldn't manage your way to the things that mattered, sitting across from each other and choosing, quietly and without ceremony, to stay. October came and the city shifted the way it did every year. The light going amber earlier, the mornings carrying the first real edge of cold, the harbor developing the particular gray-green color it took on in autumn when the angle of the sun changed and the water stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. Landon noticed the seasons differently now. He'd spent several years where October was just a logistics problem. Emma needed a heavier coat, the building assessments slowed down, his father's hip complained more in the cold and required more management. The calendar was a series of things to stay ahead of rather than anything to observe. This October, he found himself actually looking at things. The light on the water. The way the leaves in Hendricks Park went orange in the particular sequence that Emma had started documenting, page by page, in a new section of the observation notebook labeled Fall Colors, Year 1, which implied, with Emma's characteristic matter-of-factness, that there would be a Year 2 and a Year 3, and however many years it took to establish a comprehensive record. He'd started thinking in longer timelines. He noticed that too. Eleanor Sterling had her worst month in October. It came without the specific drama of a crisis, no ambulance calls, no emergency interventions, just a grinding deterioration that the doctor said was an expected phase of the treatment, a valley before the protocol could do what it was designed to do. She was exhausted in a way that sleep didn't fix. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. On the days when she had enough energy, she was still entirely herself. Opinionated about everything, precise, mildly impatient with approximation. And on the days she didn't, she slept. And Vivian and Daniel sat with the waiting that Vivian had once described as the thing that made everything feel permanent. Landon drove Vivian to her mother's apartment on 4 separate Tuesday evenings in October because Vivian's hands shook slightly on difficult driving days, and she'd admitted it once and never mentioned it again. But he'd remembered. He didn't announce what he was doing. He just texted on those Tuesdays. I'll pick you up at 6, and she texted back, okay, and that was the whole conversation. He waited in the parking structure some nights for an hour and a half while she was upstairs. He never complained about it, not because he was performing patience, but because it didn't feel like waiting. It felt like being somewhere he was supposed to be. Daniel called him once during this period, directly, not through Vivian, which meant he'd gone to some effort to get the number independently, which was very Daniel. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Landon was on his roof deck resealing the replaced board he'd fixed back in spring, and the call came from an unknown number that he almost didn't answer. "This is Daniel," Daniel said. "Sterling, Vivian's brother." "I know who you are, Daniel." "Right, yes." A pause, the gap where Daniel organized himself. I don't have a specific thing to say. I wanted to call because my mother told me to, and because I also wanted to for my own reasons." "Okay," Landon said. "My mother said to tell you that the tea she gave you in August was her good tea," Daniel said. "She wants me to make sure you understand that. She has 2 kinds, and she gave you the good one." Landon set down the sealant brush. "I appreciate that." "She doesn't give everyone the good tea. She gave my college roommate the regular tea for 3 years. "I know, Vivian told me about the tea system." "Okay, so you understand the significance." Daniel paused. "My mother thinks you're a good person. She told me that, and she doesn't say that about people carelessly." Another pause, this one different in quality. More personal, less organized. She's different lately. Good different. She smiles more. She calls me back faster. She's still working too much, but He stopped. I don't know how to say this without it sounding strange. Say it anyway, Landon said. She seems like she believes she's allowed to be happy, Daniel said. She spent a lot of years not quite believing that, like happiness was something that happened to other people or something she'd get to eventually after enough work. And lately, she seems like she thinks it's allowed. A pause. I think that's because of you. Landon looked out over the rooftops. A pigeon was doing something ambitious on the edge of the water tower 3 buildings over. She got there herself, Landon said. I just tried not to make it harder. That's the thing, though, Daniel said. You'd be surprised how rare that is. They talked for another 10 minutes about nothing in particular. Daniel asked about Emma. Landon asked about a project Daniel was working on. There was a brief exchange about Savannah that went nowhere useful, but Daniel seemed to enjoy it. When they hung up, Landon stood on the roof for a while, and the afternoon was cool and the city was all around him in every direction, and he thought about the specific rarity of not making things harder for people you loved. He thought about how long he'd been doing that alone, carrying things without making them other people's problems, managing quietly, running on the maintenance mode that kept everything functional and nobody burdened. He'd thought of it as strength for a long time. He was beginning to understand it had also been, in some part, a long habit of not asking. He went back to the sealant. The board was solid now. It would hold. Eleanor improved in November. The doctors called it a response, which was clinical language for something that felt to Vivian and Daniel like a full breath after months of shallow ones. She started eating better. She started calling people again. She had Landon and Vivian over for dinner on a Saturday in early November and cooked herself, despite Vivian's pointed concerns, because Eleanor Sterling had opinions about who was allowed to cook in her kitchen, and those opinions had not changed with illness. She made soup from a recipe she'd had for 40 years, which she described as adjusted over time, but which Daniel, under his breath, described as basically different every time because she cooks by feeling, not measurement. The soup was excellent. Landon said so, and Eleanor said, I know. And Vivian looked at the ceiling briefly. Afterward, while Vivian helped clear the table, a negotiation that had taken several minutes, Eleanor yielding exactly as much ground as she chose to, and not a millimeter more, Eleanor sat with Landon in the living room with her tea and asked him questions with the unhurried directness of someone who had stopped pretending that time was infinite and had decided to use the time she had for things that mattered. She asked about his mother. He talked about her, a woman who'd died when Landon was 21, a school teacher who'd had her own particular stubbornness about things she believed in, who'd taught Landon to read and then spent years somewhat exasperated by how much he read and how little he talked about it. Eleanor listened without interruption, which was not her natural mode, and when he finished, she said, She sounds like someone who prepared you on purpose. I think she did, he said. Good mothers do that, Eleanor said. She looked at her tea. I tried to do that with Vivian. Whether I got it right is above my authority to judge. You got some things very right, Landon said. Eleanor looked at him. Name one. She watches how people treat people who can't do anything for them, he said. She learned that from somewhere. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Her expression was composed in the way of someone who felt something and had decided not to look away from it. Her father did that, she said. He was the one who put that in her first. She looked at the window. He would have liked you. It was simply said, not performed, and it landed the way simple, true things landed, without ceremony, with weight. I hope so, Landon said. From the kitchen, Vivian and Daniel's voices rose briefly in the specific register of siblings disagreeing about something domestic and minor, then settled. Eleanor looked toward the kitchen and then back at Landon with a small expression that was partly amusement and partly something older and more complicated. She's going to fight you sometimes, Eleanor said, not because she's difficult, because she's spent so long being the one who held things together that letting someone help it requires her to do something she was never taught to do. Ask, Landon said. Ask, Eleanor confirmed, and believe the answer. I know, he said. We're working on it. So is she, Eleanor said, more than she tells you. He believed that. He filed it away not as a problem to solve, but as something to hold, the way you held information about a structure's history, not to alarm you, but to inform your understanding of why it carried its weight the way it did. The anniversary arrived on a Tuesday in early December, exactly 1 year from the night at Tidal. Landon had thought about how to mark it and had arrived at the conclusion that marking it too deliberately would be its own kind of performance. Vivian was not a grand gesture person. She was a specific thing person. The distinction mattered. Emma was with Pop for the night, which Pop had arranged with the timing of someone who had been briefed, almost certainly by Emma herself, who had been tracking the anniversary with the diligence she brought to significant events, and had informed Pop 2 weeks earlier that a particular Tuesday in December was important, and she needed to be at his house. "She planned this?" Vivian asked, when Landon explained it. "She planned this," Landon confirmed. "She's 7 now. She turned 7 in March, and she's been getting more organized ever since." They went back to Tidal, which had been Vivian's suggestion, offered in a text so casual that it was clearly something she'd been thinking about for a while. "Are you sentimental enough to want to go back to that restaurant?" He'd replied, "I'm sentimental about specific things. That's one of them." She'd replied, "Same table if they have it." They had the same table. The harbor was dark outside, December now, the water heavier and the city lights reflecting differently on choppy water than they had on rain-wet glass. The young waiter from a year ago was gone. Promoted, the hostess said, to a different location. Their waiter tonight was older, more efficient, less anxious. Things changed and things stayed the same, and the space between those two facts was where most of life happened. They ordered. Vivian asked about the fish again, the same questions, and Landon watched her listen to the answers with the same real attention she'd given them a year ago, and thought that this was one of the things about her he'd never quite gotten used to. The consistency of her attention, the way it didn't dim with familiarity. A lot of people paid attention until they thought they understood you, and then the attention became less necessary. Vivian paid attention like it was the point, not the means. The food was good. The conversation came easily, the way conversations came when you'd had hundreds of them and had stopped tracking whether they were going well. They talked about Eleanor's improvement and about Daniel's new job prospect that had him cautiously optimistic and therefore managing his optimism with great effort, and about Emma's latest ocean question. This week's had been whether fish slept, which had led Landon down a research path about unihemispheric sleep and rest cycles that he'd found genuinely fascinating and reported to Emma in more detail than she'd asked for, and she'd said, "I only needed the short answer, Daddy," which was fair. They talked about the year, not in a formal way, not a review, just the natural conversation that happened when two people who had been through a lot of things together looked back without needing to make it significant. The board meeting and Mercer backing down. The aquarium and the octopus, and Emma announcing she knows things with the gravity of a decree. The parking garage calls and the roof deck, and between the lines and the coffee shop on Ashford Street that had become theirs in the way that places became yours without a formal declaration. Eleanor's tea. The gala. The Wednesday kitchen in September when Vivian had said, "I'm scared," and Landon had said, "I know, me too," and neither of them had pretended that away. "What did you think?" Vivian said. "That night, when I walked in and said that." He looked at her. "About your eyes?" "Yes." He thought about it honestly. "I thought you were strange," he said. "In a good way. I thought you were the kind of person who said the thing they were actually thinking instead of the thing they were supposed to say. And I thought that was either going to be very interesting or very complicated." "And?" "Both," he said. She smiled. "What else?" "I thought you'd been carrying something," he said. "I didn't know what, but the way you said it, like you'd noticed something you hadn't expected to notice and you were reporting it before you could think better of it, like it had gotten out before the management system caught up." She looked at him. "You got all of that from 4 words." "I got a feeling from 4 words," he said. "I spent the next 6 hours confirming it." She looked down at the table for a moment. Then she reached into her bag, the same bag, he noticed, same black leather, slightly more worn, and took out a small envelope, the size of a note card, and set it on the table. He looked at it. "Open it," she said. Inside was a small piece of stiff card stock, the kind you'd find in a quality stationery set, with 4 words written in Vivian's handwriting. Spare and legible, no excess flourish. She wrote like she talked. You have kind eyes. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at her. I've been thinking about why I said that, she said. For a year, on and off, I've been thinking about what the actual thing was underneath it. She was looking at the card in his hand. I walked in, and you'd been waiting, and I told you what I expected, that you'd be irritated, that I'd get some version of the face that people made when they'd wasted their time on you. She paused. But you just looked at me like a person, not like a name, not like a problem, not like something to decide about, just like a person who had arrived. You had arrived, he said. I know, she said, but you didn't make me pay for arriving late. You didn't make me earn back the ground I'd lost. She looked at him steadily. I'd spent so long in rooms where everything was transactional, where people looked at me and calculated, that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be just looked at. She paused. Your eyes were kind. That was the actual observation. Not a compliment, not an opener, just, I saw it and I said it. I'm glad you did, he said. I know you are. A slight pause. I am too. Very. He set the card down carefully on the table between them. A year ago, he'd been sitting at this table counting minutes and rehearsing exits. He'd been tired in a way he'd stopped tracking because tracking it didn't help. He'd been doing the math on solo parenting and aging parents, and a professional life that was fine but not particularly alive, and he'd been arriving at numbers that added up correctly but didn't amount to anything that felt like what was supposed to be possible. He thought about what he'd tell himself if he could go back to that man with the straight silverware and the phone face down and the 5 more minutes resignation. He thought he'd say, wait. Not because something magical was coming, not because the universe was arranging things for a reason, but because the thing that was about to walk through that door was real, imperfect and complicated, and sometimes scared and occasionally too managing and not always easy, and real was worth waiting for. The world didn't owe anyone easy. Easy was just the version of things where you stopped paying attention. Real required your full presence, your patience on the days when patience cost you something, your willingness to sit in the difficult parts without immediately trying to fix them. He'd spent a lot of years being good at the hard parts alone. He hadn't known, until this year, how different the hard parts felt when you weren't doing them by yourself. After dinner, they walked along the harbor. It was cold enough that Vivian had her coat pulled tight, and Landon's breath showed in the air, and the harbor was dark and significant beside them, the way large bodies of water were significant at night when you couldn't see where they ended. The dock lights threw their orange reflections on the water the same as they had a year ago. Some things recurred regardless of what had changed around them. Emma told me something last week, Vivian said. What? She told me that I was her person. She said it the way you said something you'd been turning over, trying to figure out the right setting to say it in. She was explaining her social structure to me. She has a very organized social structure. She has people for specific things. And she said Pop was her history person, and Marcus was her funny person, and her teacher, Ms. Calloway, was her school person, and you were her main person. She paused. And then she said I was her person. What does that mean? Landon said. I asked her that, Vivian said. She thought about it, and she said it meant I was the person she wanted to tell things to, new things, important things. She stopped walking for a moment. She said she saw a bird this morning with an unusual tail, and her first thought was to tell me about it. Landon stopped beside her. The harbor moved at their left. The city was all its sounds and lights behind them. She didn't tell me that, he said. She told you I was her person? She told me she'd seen the bird, he said. She didn't tell me about the first thought part. Vivian looked out at the water. I sat with that for a while before I said anything, she said, because she said it like it was just information, like she was giving me data, and I needed to understand what I was being given before I responded. What did you say? I said she was my person too. Vivian looked at the water. She nodded like it confirmed something, and then she asked if we could look up the bird, and we did. A small pause. It was a cedar waxwing. We added it to the notebook. Landon looked at the water alongside her. The cedar waxwing entry was going to be in the notebook. A year from now, and 5 years from now, it was going to be in there. The bird with the unusual tail, the woman who became Emma's person, the notebook that was accumulating the record of a life that was turning out to be larger than the one he'd been running on maintenance mode. "Thank you," he said. Vivian looked at him. "For what?" "For being her person," he said. "She doesn't give that out carelessly. You earned it." "She's easy to love," Vivian said. "She's not, actually," Landon said. "She's very specific. She requires being met on her terms. A lot of people try to meet her on theirs, and she goes quiet on them." He looked at the water. "You met her on hers from the start, the plankton fact, letting her lead at the aquarium, not performing enthusiasm at her, but just being actually interested." He paused. "She felt that." "I was actually interested," Vivian said. "I know," he said. "That's what she felt." They walked further along the harbor. The cold was the honest kind, the kind that didn't pretend, and Landon found that he didn't mind it the way he usually minded cold. The cold had context now, was attached to something, which made it less like a condition to endure and more like a detail of a specific night he was going to remember. He thought about what the year had done. He thought about how you couldn't see these things from inside them, not fully. You lived through things at ground level and only understood the shape of them later, from the slightly higher vantage of time passing. He hadn't known, standing outside Tidal a year ago, that he was at the beginning of something. You never knew that from the ground. You only saw the shape of things from the other end. From this end, the shape was this: a woman who said true things when she meant to keep them inside. A daughter who added people to her notebook. A father on a back porch talking about sodium and meaning something else entirely. A bookstore on Ashford Street and an aquarium on a Saturday and a parking garage call at 3 a.m. and 4 words on a note card that had accumulated a year's worth of meaning since the first time they were spoken. It wasn't the life he'd been planning. He'd stopped planning around year 3 of solo parenting, when he'd understood that plans were just maps, and maps were not the terrain. The terrain required something else: attention, adjustment, the willingness to keep moving without being certain where you were going. He'd been moving, and the moving had brought him here. He didn't know if he believed that things worked out for a reason. He'd seen enough structures fail to know that the universe didn't particularly favor the careful or the good. It was indifferent in the way that physics was indifferent, operating by its own rules regardless of who was standing in the building. What he believed was that how you moved through things shaped what you arrived at, that the patient accumulation of honest choices had a direction to it, even when you couldn't see the direction from inside the choosing. He'd been patient, not perfectly. He'd lost his patience at his father about the sodium more times than he could count, and he'd been short with Emma on bad nights, and he'd had the fight with Vivian about the gala that had been necessary and uncomfortable and real. But underneath the imperfections, underneath the flatness of the maintenance mode years, he'd kept something intact, some core of how he chose to be in the world, present, honest, not making things harder for people than they already were. He hadn't known that was worth anything to anyone. It turned out it was worth everything to one specific person. Vivian stopped walking. They were at the far end of the harbor walk, where the path curved and the dock lights were farther apart, and the water was darker and louder. She stopped and turned toward him, and her face in the low light was the face he'd been learning for a year. Not the public face, not the professional face, not even the careful social face. Just hers. The actual one. "I want to say something," she said. "Okay," he said. "I've been thinking about how to say it for a while," she said. "I've drafted it, which is embarrassing. I draft things when I'm trying to get them exactly right, and I'm worried the first version will be wrong." "What's the drafted version?" She almost smiled. "Too long. Too organized." She looked at the water briefly and then back at him. "The honest version is this. I spent a long time believing that the way I lived, keeping things managed, keeping people at a distance I could control, being the person who handled things so that things were handled, I spent a long time believing that was just who I was. Not a choice. A nature." She paused. "It took until this year to understand it was a choice. A very old choice that I'd made so long ago I'd forgotten making it." "What changed?" he said. "You didn't ask me to be different," she said. "You never asked me to manage less or be less or make myself smaller. You stayed. You drove on Tuesdays without making it a thing. You came to the gala in your ironed shirt and talked to Preston Mercer like he was just a person in a room. She shook her head slightly. You let my mother give you the good tea and you understood what it meant. You listened to Daniel ramble about Savannah for 10 minutes because he needed to. She stopped. You were just present, quietly, consistently present. And that turns out to be the thing that I didn't know I needed, the thing I didn't know how to ask for. Landon was looking at her steadily. I love you, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying it as a conclusion to an argument. I'm saying it because it's what I mean, and I've been saying every other version of it for months, and this is just the accurate version. He looked at her in the low harbor light, the dark coat, the cold-making color in her face, the eyes that were exactly what he'd seen across the restaurant a year ago, except that now he knew what was behind them. The history and the fear and the precision and the care and the quick, real smile that still happened faster than she could manage it. I love you, he said. I've known it for a while. I wasn't sure it was the right time to say it. When were you going to say it? When you did, he said. She looked at him. That's terrible planning. I know, he said. What if I'd been slower? I'd have waited, he said. Obviously. She shook her head, but the smile was there. The real one. The one that arrived before she'd decided to let it. She reached up and fixed his collar, the way Emma had done before the gala, the specific gesture of someone who was paying attention to a specific person. And he stood still for it, and the harbor moved beside them, cold and dark and full of things doing exactly what they needed to do. In the spring, Eleanor came with them to Hendricks Park. She walked slowly and required 2 rest stops and had opinions about the bench surfaces that she communicated to Vivian in a running commentary. But she was there, in the afternoon light, watching Emma lead the expedition the way Emma always led expeditions. Notebook in hand, boots on regardless of conditions, a focused determination to document everything worth documenting. Pop came too. Landon had suggested it once, tentatively, and both Eleanor and Pop had agreed with the enthusiasm of 2 people who'd been waiting to be asked. Pop walked with his cane, and Eleanor kept pace beside him, and within 20 minutes they were having a heated discussion about whether sparrows or finches were more interesting, which was a debate with no stakes, and which they were both approaching with complete seriousness. Vivian walked beside Landon and watched the 2 of them. They're going to argue all afternoon, she said. Pop argues because he likes people, Landon said. If he's arguing with her, he likes her. She's the same, Vivian said. She watched Eleanor gesture towards something in the trees with the authority of a person making an unassailable point. She seems good today. She does, Landon said. She has more good days than bad now, Vivian said. The doctors say the numbers are… She stopped. I don't want to put too much on the numbers. Then don't, he said. Just watch her argue about birds. Vivian looked at her mother. Something moved in her face. Not sadness exactly, more the specific tenderness of watching someone you love be wholly themselves in an ordinary moment. The kind of moment that passed unrecorded and was gone almost before you could register it, except that if you were paying attention, if you'd learned to pay the particular quality of attention that the year had taught her, you could hold it, not in a photograph, not in a document, just in the way the body registered what the mind had decided to keep. Emma appeared at Vivian's side, slightly out of breath, notebook held open. There's a red-tailed hawk up the hill, she said. I need someone to watch it while I write so I don't miss the wing position when it moves. I'll watch, Vivian said. Emma took her hand, unselfconsciously, the way she took Landon's hand, the way she'd stopped tracking the gesture because it had become ordinary, and pulled her up the path. Landon stood at the bottom of the hill and watched them go, his daughter and his person moving up through the afternoon light, Emma with her notebook, Vivian with her full attention, both of them heading toward a bird that Emma needed to document because the world was full of things worth paying close attention to. Behind him, Pop and Eleanor were still arguing about sparrows. The park was doing what parks did in spring, coming back to itself, loud with birds and children and the simple noise of things being alive. The harbor was somewhere south of them, out of sight, doing what it always did. He thought about the transparent fish, the ones whose only visible parts were their eyes, moving through the deep water, invisible except for what they chose to look with. He thought about his daughter drawing those eyes larger than the rest of the body because the eyes were the part you could see. He thought about 4 words spoken across a restaurant a year and a half ago by a woman who'd seen something in him before she'd decided to. He thought about what it meant to be seen, not the performed version, not being noticed because of what you'd built or what you could offer or what position you held, but the other kind. The kind where someone looked at you in an ordinary moment, in an ironed shirt at a table for 2, waiting with patience you hadn't calculated and dignity you hadn't dressed up, and saw something in you that you'd stopped expecting anyone to find. The thing about kindness was that it was easy to miss. It didn't announce itself. It didn't have a press release or a board meeting or a headline. It showed up in 32 minutes of waiting without anger, in a plate of fish that tilted and a smile that followed, in Tuesday drives and good tea and a hand on a child's shoulder that stopped being tracked because it had become ordinary. The world moved fast and loud, and it rewarded volume. It rewarded the impressive and the strategic and the visible. It didn't particularly reward the quiet, steady, patient work of just being a decent human being in the small moments that nobody wrote articles about. But some people noticed. Some people had been in enough rooms with enough impressive, strategic, visible people that when they walked into a restaurant on a rainy Tuesday night and saw a man sitting alone with his phone face down and his silverware straight, waiting without performance, waiting the way a person waited when they decided that how they behaved when things went wrong was important, some people saw that and understood they were in the presence of something they didn't encounter every day. And some things, once seen, couldn't be unseen. Emma came back down the hill with her notebook open and Vivian beside her, and she launched immediately into the wing position data she'd documented, reading from her notes with the rapid authority of a scientist presenting findings. And Vivian listened with her full attention, asking the follow-up questions, and Landon stood in the afternoon light of an ordinary Saturday in spring and thought, this is it. This is the actual thing, not the dramatic version, not the arrival at the destination after the hard journey, just this. The accumulated ordinary weight of a life that had room in it for all the people and things he loved, a life that had been reshaped not by one decision, but by hundreds of small ones, each one chosen in the direction of presence and honesty and the willingness to stay. He'd learned something this year that he was still in the process of understanding, that strength wasn't the absence of need, that being capable wasn't the same as being closed, that the most honest and difficult thing he'd ever done was not the solo years, managing, holding, keeping everything running, but this, letting someone in, trusting that being seen was safe, believing slowly and with evidence and not all at once, that he didn't have to earn his place in the lives of the people who chose him. He was still learning it. That was fine. The learning had no deadline. Emma closed her notebook and announced that she was hungry and that Pop had promised her something from the food cart, and she pulled Vivian back down the path toward the entrance where Pop and Eleanor were still debating birds with the energy of people who had found a topic worthy of the argument. The park folded them all in together, the old man with the cane and the woman who'd outfought a disease that had no particular reason to cooperate, and the girl who documented everything worth documenting, and the woman who'd learned, slowly, to put down the management and just live. And Landon Hayes, 33 years old now, structural engineer, single father, a man who ironed his own shirts and made grilled cheese with room temperature butter and drove on Tuesdays without making it a thing, a man who had been quietly decent in a world that didn't always make room for quiet decency, watched his people move through the afternoon and felt, with the particular force of simple true things, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because it had been arranged, not because it had been easy, because he'd stayed. Because she'd said you have kind eyes before she'd decided to, and he'd waited 5 more minutes before he hadn't, and the door had opened, and everything that followed had been the work and the difficulty and the ordinary gorgeous accumulation of 2 people choosing, every day, to show up for each other. That was the whole story. That was enough. That was, it turned out, everything.